You know, when was the last time the United States faced an invasion on its own soil? That was over 200 years ago when they were battling Canada, which was still a British colony back then. The British pushed into the US mainland from the north and actually saw some success. They even marched all the way to Washington and burned down the White House. But that was before the US had its current territorial expanse. If you look back over 200 years since then, the United States has deployed troops into conflicts all over the world. The thing is, those were all wars fought outside US territory, serving America's interests on the international stage, or as some might say, spreading democracy. Since 1812, more than 2 centuries have passed, and not a single nation has dared to violate the US mainland. Why is that? Will this change in the future? Let's look at the map of the United States, stretching over 2,800 miles across North America. The US is a vast country, sandwiched between 2 enormous oceans on its east and west coasts. Here's another more detailed map of the US terrain. The west coast of the US isn't just bordered by the Pacific Ocean, it's also shielded by high mountain ranges in the northwest and north. To the south are the vast deserts of Mexico. That alone should give you an idea of why invading the US from the west is virtually impossible. If some nation wanted to attack the US from this direction, they'd have to contend with a massive ocean, ice and snow, towering mountains, and even deserts. To the east, although the terrain isn't as rugged and diverse as the west, there's still an entire Atlantic Ocean to cross if you want to reach the US. So geography and terrain play a huge role in answering our question. But it seems like we're still overlooking something. Japan is separated from the US by an entire ocean and has rugged terrain, yet the US defeated Japan on its own soil. If that's the case, countries across the Atlantic could still attack the US or Canada and Mexico from the north and south. Invading the US would seem entirely feasible. But why has no one dared to violate the US mainland? That's a much longer and more complex historical tale about why the US became the most powerful nation in human history to the point where no one dares to touch it. In reality, the US didn't initially have the massive terrain advantage on the West Coast that it enjoys today. One way or another, the US began expanding its territory westward after the war with Mexico in 1848. And the result was Mexico being forced to cede its western territories to the US. Only then did the US officially gain an entire ocean, formidable mountain ranges, and vast surrounding deserts. With the West Coast came something many nations craved: gold. The gold rush of 1848 helped make America rich. The Mississippi River, running through the mainland, also made domestic transportation and trade easier. Now, with plenty of cash, plus geographical and topographical protection, a superpower named America was taking shape. Feeling secure and incredibly wealthy, the US began to act as any nation would in that situation, becoming an empire. The US used its money to build a powerful military and deployed that force around the world to expand its global influence. The US took islands like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines under its wing. And while many of those places are now independent, a good number of them still remain under US influence today. The problem is, once it expanded, the US inevitably clashed with other imperial powers, increasing its risk of attack. One attack completely shifted America's perspective. The US felt it couldn't just sit there alone, thinking it was safe anymore. The US cast aside its policy of having no allies, of not getting involved in world wars, to align with other nations. Declaring war on the Axis powers led by Japan, the US and its allies won the war. But they then stepped into a new conflict, the Cold War. The world at that time had only the US and the Soviet Union as superpowers, and both scrambled for global influence. After the devastation of the war, Western European nations were too weak to stand against the Soviet Union. Now, if the Soviets were to invade them and swallow up Europe, they'd have no strength to resist. The US and Western European countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. To prevent communism from spreading across the Pacific, the US signed bilateral treaties with nations in that region. South American countries also agreed with the US to establish the Rio Treaty. In the Middle East, The US also forged strong relationships with regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Israel. These countries all received military aid from the US to serve their own interests and those of the US. That aid included selling weapons, military equipment, military training, or even stationing US military bases on their territory. Many nations even wanted the US to maintain a military presence in their country for protection. The result is US military bases sprawling across the territory of 80 countries, totaling up to 800, an insane number. These agreements helped the US get even richer from trading war materiel. At the same time, it also forced the US to continuously invest in its military to meet demand. The US consistently invests hundreds of billions of dollars in defense each year, leading the world and equaling many other nations combined. In 1991, the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the US became the world's sole remaining superpower. Even so, the US still considers its alliance system a prerequisite for maintaining its position. Another reason the US wants to maintain its alliance system is the rise of powers like Russia, China, and India after the Soviet Union's collapse. NATO welcomed former Soviet bloc members, including one that infuriated Russia. Russia began invading Ukraine in 2014 and launched a full-scale war in 2022. This once again put US allies in Europe on high alert. A similar situation is unfolding in the Pacific region. China is growing increasingly wealthy and powerful. They're expanding their global economic influence with the Belt and Road Initiative. China also threatens US allies with long-standing territorial disputes. These factors keep US allies on high alert. But that doesn't mean these allies are becoming increasingly dependent on the US and are willing to unconditionally align with it in exchange for protection. Now we have the answer to the question, why has no one dared to invade the United States? If the US has such a favorable geographic position, sandwiched between two oceans, then today, with modern satellite technology, the US can absolutely detect any attack being launched against them even before it reaches the mainland. Even if somehow an adversary did reach US territory, the rugged terrain on the West Coast would make an invasion incredibly difficult. Another reason is much simpler. The US is too rich and too powerful. With the largest and most advanced military in the world, coupled with a massive economy, the US can absolutely defeat any invasion aimed at its mainland. Furthermore, with a global alliance system that is increasingly reliant on the US, any nation that invades the US would have to fight a colossal alliance alone. Both the past and present have proven, being a superpower is no joke. And any nation intending to invade the United States, well, they should probably forget about it as soon as the idea pops into their head. Do you think any country will be powerful enough to challenge the US superpower status on its own soil in the future? Why or why not? Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts and let Trun Discovery know. If you found this content helpful, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to give me the motivation to make more videos. Thank you very much.